Throughout history, there's always been collaborators who've been enticed by personal benefit to turn against their own, choosing to aid those who seek to oppress and destroy them. During Hitler's rise to power, there was even a group of Jews who supported him, agreeing that everything the Nazis said about them was true, except the good ones like themselves, of course. This was a group of people who, rather than fighting for what was clearly right, chose to instead engage in a pathetic and desperate act of self-preservation, attempting to appeal to what they believe the people who hated them considered to be respectable, in the hope that, once the dust settled, once that got done throwing their peers under the bus, they would be accepted among those who hated the others of their group. Then, when the time came, they were murdered in the Holocaust anyway. This is no different in the case of Palestine. There are Palestinian collaborators with Israel of all types, though given the clear and obvious severity of the oppression faced by the Palestinian people at the hands of Israel and its allies, they are a very, very small minority. The worst and most damaging of these collaborators are the propagandists, those willing to lend a Palestinian face and voice to Israeli propaganda and dehumanize themselves and other Palestinians in the hopes of deriving some sort of personal benefit. Now, Israel has had some difficulty finding people willing to do this, so there's not that many of them, but they nonetheless do exist. And due to the presently ongoing Gaza genocide, which Israel and its allies are desperate to justify, they've been getting amplified a lot more lately than ever before, both by Israel itself, by social media platforms, and by the pro-Israel Western mainstream media in an attempt to create the appearance of a sort of Palestinian stamp of approval on Israeli policies, goals, actions, and propaganda. There are three main types of incentives, which are not mutually exclusive and usually overlap somewhat, that entice people like this into selling out. One are incentives created by the Israeli state itself, which attempts to recruit pro-Israel propagandists from among the Palestinian population in exchange for material gain. They also attempt to recruit Palestinian prisoners, often through coercive means, like threatening to kill their family or threatening to out them as gay and stuff like that. The second is somewhat less direct, but not any less perverse, because being willing to lend one's Palestinian identity to demeaning the Palestinian people and their struggle can open up the way to plenty of supposedly prestigious opportunities for people who would otherwise be wholly unremarkable. The West is full of pro-Israel media outlets, think tanks, and NGOs for whom a Palestinian who speaks English and who's willing to say what they want them to say is like finding the Holy Grail. The third incentive is the pro-Israel niche on social media. This is an audience that is hungry to give their views, and perhaps even open up their wallets, to someone who's willing to recite their usual media diet of ridiculous anti-Palestinian propaganda, but prefaced with phrases like, "As a Palestinian, if you're willing to give up whatever dignity that you have and do that, you can make a pretty penny for very little effort." In this video, we're going to be covering three different individuals, each of whom primarily fits into one of these three categories. Mosab Hasan Yousef, known as the Son of Hamas, John Aziz, and Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib. We'll be looking at how they operate, the sort of propaganda that they spread, how they got to where they are now, and how utterly pathetic and embarrassing they all are. This video was made possible thanks to my supporters on Patreon and Ko-fi. If you like it and you'd like to see more like it, consider heading over there and supporting me yourself. Mosab Hasan Yousef, the Son of Hamas. Mosab Hasan Yousef, perhaps more accurately referred to as Mosab Hasan Yousef, is the son of Hasan Yousef, who was one of the co-founders of Hamas. Yousef has released a couple of books about himself, which is where most of his personal story has been gleaned from, but he should not be taken as a reliable source regarding his own background, for reasons that will soon become extremely apparent. Yousef claims that he was arrested by Israel as a teenager for throwing stones at occupying IDF soldiers in the West Bank. The Israelis put him into prison for this, and you would think that that would make him somewhat resent them. But no, according to him, the opposite happened. During his time in prison, he saw other Palestinian prisoners attacking collaborators, and that convinced him that the Israelis were not actually the bad guys at all. The Palestinians were. So when the Shin Bet, the Israeli equivalent of the FBI, approached him in prison with an offer to become a double agent for them, he accepted. According to his own biography, which, to be clear, is a piece of carefully crafted Israeli propaganda that in reality is extremely unlikely to have even been written by him. He then spent 10 years basically being James Bond, an incredible super spy who selflessly and almost single-handedly foiled countless evil Palestinian schemes against all that is good and holy in the world. How much of Yousef's story up until this point is actually true or false is unclear, but in 2007 he abruptly moved to the USA, where he has lived since. It seems that in spite of him having spent at least 10 years as a spy for Israel, they still viewed him as a Palestinian and thus were unwilling to give him the Israeli citizenship that he would have needed to live in Israel. So his only option was to instead move to an Israel-aligned country and claim political asylum there on the basis that if he went back to the West Bank, he would get killed for being a literal Israeli spy. It's unclear if Yousef has maintained any formal ties to Israeli state entities since then, though given his past and present activities, it's an extremely safe bet to assume that he remains an agent of the Israeli state in some capacity. Though nowadays his role has shifted from being a spy into being a pro-Israel propagandist. He gives anti-Palestinian talks at pro-Israel events, makes pro-Israel media appearances, and spams Israeli propaganda on social media. Interestingly, his social media accounts appear to be very carefully managed. He follows no one and uses social media more like how a brand would, with topics and themes that almost perfectly align with Israel's frequent coordinated propaganda blitzes. There's no record of him ever having had any profession at all besides this, so it's safe to assume that this is where he makes most of his money from. His only marketable skill appears to be Palestinian who affirms Israeli propaganda, and that's precisely what he does, day in and day out. Yousef is a bit different to most other pro-Israel Palestinians though, in that his rhetoric, at least to a non-Israeli audience, comes off as very extreme. He mirrors the very worst of the Israeli far-right, to the extent that his propaganda doesn't really seem to be designed to actually change anyone's minds. Rather, it seems like something that is designed to be just sort of entertainment for the already convinced, or perhaps an attempt to pull the Western far-right into the Israeli cause. For example, he's made it clear that he believes that Palestinians don't actually exist, and that Palestinian is a fake nationality invented as an excuse to hate Jews, a genocidal conspiracy theory popular among right-wing Zionists that tends not to land very well with anyone outside of their bubble. That's why, almost without exception, when he uses the word Palestinian or Palestine, it's always in quotes. Yet ironically, if you search for him, he's invariably described as a Palestinian. Poor guy. He also outright denies the Nakba, which was the 1948 systemic Israeli expulsion and killings of more than 800,000 Palestinians, and he claims that Islam is the equivalent of Nazism, and once said that all 2 billion Muslims in the world are aggressive and violent, and that if he had to choose between all of them and a cow, he would choose the cow. Now, Yousef is a fairly extreme example, given the rhetoric that he spouts and his clear and openly admitted ties to the Israeli state. His persona seems to have been a relatively early attempt by Israel to create a sort of weaponized Palestinian who they could strategically deploy to be like, look, even a Palestinian says what we say about them. But they kind of jump the gun a bit, because the kind of stuff that he says is rarely going to land very well with an audience that isn't already convinced that Palestinians are basically animals. Nonetheless, he does sometimes, surprisingly, manage to fool people who consider themselves to be more on the left. For example, in 2023, the YouTuber Jessie Gender released one single pro-Palestine video. This resulted in backlash against her from Zionist colonialists in her audience, who accused her of anti-Semitism and invalidating their feelings because she denounced the Gaza genocide. Jessie reacted to this by making, I shit you not, a 4-hour-long video that absolutely no one has ever watched in full, in which she tries to have her cake and eat it too, by attempting the impossible task of still maintaining a pro-Palestinian stance, while also apologizing to and appeasing the anti-Palestinian Zionists in her audience. As part of this both-siding exercise, she went looking for Palestinian voices who were willing to affirm Israeli propaganda, and so she landed on Mosab Yousef. She ended up citing him in the video, and then later edited that part out when she was criticized for it. His book still remains in the list of citations for her video, however. So yes, ridiculous as it may be, it still does seem to be possible for some well-meaning people to be fooled by Yousef's ridiculous propaganda. Most of the others in the Palestinian traitor industry are more measured than he is, though. Rather than practically holding up a sign that says, "Yes, it's true, we're inferior," like he does, they are a bit more subtle. Their strategy is instead based around being pro-peace Palestinians, a position that they juxtapose with a supposed anti-peace Palestinian majority. Peace, of course, is just a sort of positive-sounding term that practically everyone supports in some way or another, but it can mean wholly different things to different people. And peace on the terms of one group often might not even be considered peace at all by the terms of the other. So repeating that empty platitude of being pro-peace helps them to pull people in for the next part of their grift. What they actually mean by pro-peace is peace on Israeli terms, something which they never explicitly say outright, but which is nonetheless clearly implied from their framing and rhetoric in general. According to the narrative that these pro-Israel propagandists pretty much unanimously abide by, the primary barrier to this peace is not the Israelis, who have been expelling, killing and occupying Palestinians since before Israel was even actually founded, but rather the Palestinians themselves. They are framed as unreasonable for not simply accepting their own subjugation and continuing to demand that any peace comes with actual justice. Often, in an attempt to appear more balanced, they will denounce the worst of the Israeli right wing, such as Benjamin Netanyahu, which helps them to pull in well-meaning people who aren't very well informed yet, especially given that someone who claims to be Palestinian saying all of that can give it a sort of special air of legitimacy to an unguarded or uncritical viewer. As a contemporary example, a very common refrain from these types is to blame Israel's massacre of at the very least tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza on the Palestinians themselves for starting it, or for not freeing the hostages, or for not surrendering. While Mosab Yousef is happy to just sort of come out and say that they deserve to die, these more subtle types will instead act like this Israeli mass murder and destruction is somehow not Israel's fault. A lamentable but necessary action that Israel has been forced into, which is not at all linked to the previous 7+ decades of Israeli occupation, oppression and colonialism. The Palestinians bring it all upon themselves. This brings us to John Aziz. John Aziz is a British man who magically rediscovered his Palestinian ancestry after October 7, 2023, when he realized that he could make a whole career out of tacking as a Palestinian onto pro-Israel talking points. That is not an exaggeration. It's like his catchphrase. Just look at this. It never ends. He initially started doing this on Twitter, which quickly led to his account there becoming very popular among pro-Israel people who were happy to see a Palestinian affirm their beliefs. Before October 7th, he had about 800 followers and had publicly stated that he was quitting Twitter because Elon Musk turned it into a white nationalist platform, and he did not want to support funneling advertising revenue to such a person. Anyway, so now, a year later, he's rebranded his account, he's got 50,000 followers, and it's monetized, which makes him money off that same ad revenue. This then led to him being given the opportunity to write pro-Israel articles in relatively large pro-Israel media outlets, which led to him realizing that he had just found his golden ticket to riches and social circles that he otherwise had no means of entering. Spouting pro-Israel talking points while claiming to be a Palestinian undoubtedly generates him a decent income from social media monetization and gives him opportunities in the mainstream media that would otherwise be totally closed to him if they were based on merit, rather than just an appeal to identity. Since late 2023, Aziz has turned tweeting into what can only be described as his full-time job, posting about 1,000 times a week on his monetized account. He loves to do average everyday Palestinian things, like uncritically citing propaganda directly from the IDF, deny the genocide in Gaza and claim that Israel's massacring of civilians is just a war against Hamas, and complain about the arrest warrant against Israeli leaders by the International Criminal Court, calling it anti-Jewish racism. Early in his career, Aziz made the mistake of subjecting himself to a debate with me on my channel. It's linked in the description at the citation number that you see now. In that debate, in response to every single specific question that I asked him, in response to every single Israeli crime that I brought up, he had one single canned response, repeating the worthless platitude that war is bad over and over, or just saying, but what about Hamas? Okay, that's 2 responses. 2 canned responses. I'm sorry, John Aziz, I lied about you.
War is horrible. War is horrible. We should be not having war.
So if you want a full idea of what this guy is actually like and how he operates, go check that out. One of his statements from that discussion that I had with him made his motivations crystal clear though.
I have a niche. I'm developing a niche of being a Palestinian who will criticize on our side as well.
Okay. For him, this is all an opportunity to fill a niche, one that was previously quite empty for pretty obvious reasons. Most Palestinians don't want to spread propaganda against themselves for their oppressors. This niche has since generated him tens of thousands of Twitter followers, opportunities to have his completely unremarkable articles published in mainstream pro-Israel media outlets like The Atlantic and Foreign Policy magazine, and gotten him numerous appearances in the right-wing media, especially with Killet. They really want you to know that he's a Palestinian, so they put it first in the titles of all of the videos in which he appears, and even make sure to put arrows pointing to him from the word Palestinian in the thumbnail. I'm Palestinian, but I don't hate Israel. They're really shameless with this, aren't they? He's also a frequent speaker at pro-Israel rallies in the UK. One of his speeches was featured on a pro-Israel news channel run by Zionist religious fanatics, who clearly consider what he's doing to be good for their cause. Note that all of these appearances are post-October 7, 2023, because that is when Aziz noticed that there was money and fame to be gained in being a pro-Israel Palestinian, and he quickly became hooked to it once he saw the amount of followers that it was generating for him, the engagement that it was getting him on his social media accounts, and the supposedly prestigious opportunities that it was opening up for him. Aziz, however, has extremely spurious claims to being a Palestinian, let alone to being a sort of representative of the Palestinian people. His father was a Palestinian from the West Bank, that much is true. However, his parents were separated when he was very young, and Aziz grew up in the UK with his mother, not with his father, who divided his time between the West Bank and the US. His mother is not Palestinian. Aziz only ever visited Palestine at most a couple of times when he was very young. He was never immersed in Palestinian culture and doesn't even speak a lick of Arabic. I've personally spoken to some members of Aziz's family and extended family who told me all about this. One of his cousins, who knew John's father very well, told me privately that John's formative upbringing did not include any Palestinian elements. No language, no songs, no stories, no food, no communication with family, no living experience in Palestine. He is totally disconnected from the Palestinian experience, culture, life, communication, history, and struggle. He has zero Palestinian immersive experience. He never took any active measure to have such an experience, despite the continuous urging and welcoming of his Palestinian family, who reached out to him often. He never actively communicated with this side of his family, never called, never participated in major happy or sad social events, was never there. His cousins were always trying to contact him and engage with him via social media like Facebook, but he was never keen on having a deep humane relationship with them. We understand that, and that is his right. Many people of Palestinian origin or any other origin lose contacts with the motherland, but for John to very suddenly discover his non-existent Palestinian half and start presenting himself as a Palestinian voice, speaking on behalf of Palestinians, on the Palestinian trauma and struggle, is a deceptive thing, to say the least. John's half-brother also confronted him on Twitter a few times, and he was very much not happy with John's lies about his background and his pro-Israel activism. John's as a Palestinian grift is quite ridiculous, and I'm saying that as someone with a somewhat similar immigrant background. I have a parent who was a first-generation immigrant from Greece, though unlike John, I was still immersed in Greek immigrant culture as I was growing up. Still, there's not really much about me left that is Greek, and I would certainly never think about making statements prefaced with "as a Greek" as I talk about Greek politics and act like I'm advocating on behalf of Greeks just because my dad was Greek. What John has decided to do is as ridiculous, but morally way worse. Because if I did do that, it would just kind of be funny. I mean, there's not really any stakes to that, is there? But with what John is doing, there is stakes. He's not merely making ridiculous claims to represent a group that he's not even meaningfully a part of. Rather, that group has been oppressed for many, many decades and is presently being slaughtered in droves every single day. And he has chosen to generate profit and gain fame by telling everyone how those who are killing them are actually fine, good, and right. In his cynical quest for fame and fortune, Aziz has even lied about his own family members to make his personal narrative more compelling. In the first article that he ever wrote for a mainstream news outlet, which was published just a month after his initial breakthrough on Twitter, he claims that his father brought him up to believe what his father did, which is a lie in of itself, given that he was not actually brought up by his father in any real meaningful respect, and he never showed any real interest in the Palestinian side of his family. But worse is the way that Aziz paints his father's beliefs. He writes, "Like many Palestinians, I was brought up by my father to think that Zionism is nothing more than settler colonialism, and that Israel is a racist apartheid regime imposed on Palestinians. I was brought up to believe that our hope as Palestinians was not only to end the military occupation in the West Bank, but to end the existence of Israel altogether. Although my father taught me to be respectful of and kind towards Jews and Israelis as individuals, he also taught me that our political ambition as Palestinians was not civil rights, peace, or compromise. It was taking back the land." So first off, there is absolutely nothing wrong with Palestinians believing what Aziz outlined there. They are both legally and morally well within their rights to demand the land that has been taken from them back from Israel. And ending the existence of Israel simply means abolishing the Israeli state, which exists specifically to enforce Jewish supremacy in the land that it occupies. Nonetheless, John lied there about his father's beliefs. His cousin, who knew John's father Adil very well, told me that, "I am deeply troubled and hurt by John's mentioning that his dad advocated for the destruction of Israel. This is very untrue. I knew Adil for many years and had many thousands of hours of discussions with him. He never advocated for the destruction of Israel or the Jewish people in Israel and Palestine. His stance was that Palestinians should have the right to freedom in their homeland. In particular, he was very anti-Hamas and anti-Muslim Brotherhood." So for John to say that about his dad, when his dad has passed and can no longer defend himself, is very hurtful and unjust. It is either that he had no idea what his dad actually believed at all, or he is simply lying to cast himself as the son who rebelled against his Palestinian dad's lust for genocide. So John Aziz, in his cynical quest for fame and wealth, is not only willing to lie about his cultural identity and heavily embellish his non-existent connection to the Palestinian reality, but also willing to slander his own father. Though I suppose that such barbarity really can't be surprising, given everything else that he does. One of the most pathetic aspects of these supposedly pro-peace Palestinian traitors is the fact that the vast majority of their audience is still ultimately Zionists. And in the eyes of most Zionists, simply being Palestinian or Arab is a problem. This results in some frankly hilarious situations where, after just getting done spending the day spreading pro-Israel propaganda, these guys take a time out to remind their audience that they themselves are Palestinians and denounce anti-Arab racism. And then their target audience responds to them like, "No, we will be racist against you, and racism is good." It has to be just about the most humiliating thing I've ever seen. The third and final subject of this video is a guy who that sort of thing happens to so often, yet who nonetheless remains steadfast in his quest to both sides the Israel-Palestine conflict in exchange for personal benefit. Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib. While Yousef is just an outright Israeli state agent, and John Aziz is more of an opportunistic social media influencer, Al-Khatib is someone who has turned being a Palestinian, who's willing to say what Zionists want to hear, into a career as a sort of pseudo-academic in the Western think tank industrial complex and the Western media. He works for institutes and councils that exist to justify Western foreign policy positions and especially Western support for Israel. Al-Khatib is by far the most pathetic and saddest of this bunch, and that's saying quite a lot given that I just talked about John Aziz. You see, he's basically been groomed ever since he was a teenager into becoming a nice, agreeable, as a Palestinian, pro-Israel activist by the US government and US government-aligned organizations. He is from Gaza, and at the age of 15, he was chosen to take part in a US State Department program of cultural exchange. From then on, he was hooked. He soon after moved to the US and gradually built a career for himself there in precisely the role that the State Department would have liked of him. He initially founded a borderline scam NGO with the impossible goal of convincing the Israelis to allow Gaza to have an airport again, which was never going to happen given that the Israelis intentionally destroyed Gaza's airport themselves back in 2002. He then moved on to studying, I shit you not, 2 degrees in intelligence studies at the American Military University, something which you're obviously not going to be doing as a Palestinian unless the US military and government see you as a potential asset. Soon after Al-Khatib's graduation, October 7th happened, and this opened up wonderful new opportunities for traders like himself. Like John Aziz, he quickly began writing, as a Palestinian, Israel is actually awesome type articles for outlets like The Atlantic, which by the way was founded by a former Israeli prison guard, and now, wouldn't you know it, he's a senior resident fellow for the Atlantic Council, a pro-US government and pro-Israel think tank. From them, he is undoubtedly earning at least a 6-figure salary, on top of all the other income that he's generating from this from other sources. He gets to appear in the media and paint himself as some sort of representative of the Palestinian people. He gets to write op-eds, he's massively expanded his social media following. Basically, he's getting all of the material rewards that anyone could possibly hope for from selling their people out, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the income that he's generating from this goes into the millions. His willingness to sell out his people has gotten him entry into the exclusive upper echelons of American society. There is a catch though, and it's the one that is what makes Al-Khatib the most pathetic of this bunch. You see, in spite of all his pro-Israel advocacy, Al-Khatib is still a Palestinian, and a Gazan Palestinian at that. So the Israelis for whom he sold his soul still treat him and his family like they're basically animals. When Al-Khatib was 11 years old, playing with his friends, 3 of them were killed in an Israeli double-tap airstrike, which is one airstrike that is then followed up by a second strike, which is intended to kill anyone who tries to help the victims of the first. In 2017, after he had already received US citizenship and was well established as a pro-Israel activist, he attempted to enter Israel to visit family who lived there, but was refused entry solely on the basis that he is Palestinian. In October 2023, his own family home, which he grew up in, was precisely and deliberately targeted in an Israeli airstrike with bombs likely provided by the same US government who he has devoted his life to, with no advance warning given to the inhabitants. 30 of his immediate and extended family members were inside. A number of them were killed, including numerous children. Later, after they were evacuated, the survivors among his family were struck again. This time, 31 of them were killed, all at once. You might think that having been a victim of such barbarity, such unimaginable trauma at the hands of the Israelis, would help Al-Khatib to see the error of his ways. But you'd be very, very wrong. His reaction to this was to write a flurry of op-eds, for which he was undoubtedly paid handsomely, that rationalized the murder of his family with the notion that the Israeli people are merely lashing out due to trauma, and that coexistence with those who are currently blowing countless families, including his own, to smithereens is the only way forward. The true party to blame for all of this, according to Al-Khatib, is always Hamas or some other Palestinian group. He is careful not to blame Israel too directly, framing what they do as at best understandable rage or some sort of accident. After all, if he was too direct with blaming Israel, that could negatively affect his social media following, his media profile, and his future job opportunities. His articles carry titles like, "An Israeli airstrike just destroyed my family home in Gaza. I refuse to be consumed by hate and revenge." And the completely ridiculous, "Why did Israel kill my family in Gaza and destroy my childhood home?" As if he's asking, "Why me? Why me? I'm one of the good ones." Despite all of this, Al-Khatib has nonetheless remained a loyal soldier of the US-based pro-Israel propaganda apparatus. This resulted in him being granted the very lucrative aforementioned Atlantic Council Fellowship, 8 months after his family was blown up in the aforementioned airstrike. Al-Khatib's post on his social media accounts about the murder of his family revealed the sort of audience who this, as a Palestinian, pro-Israel propaganda really appeals to. Already convinced Zionists, Half of these responses are generic, "I'm so sorry for your loss" posts by people who support the assault on Gaza, acting as if his family just sort of died in some sort of accident and no one in particular was to blame. And the other half, "Oh boy, everyone should have died. Ask your Hamas criminal terrorist sewer rats to surrender and hand over immediately all the hostages alive and dead immediately and unconditionally. End of leveling Gaza. Bye-bye. That is Hamas Arabs. So F you. 70 of your family members in one house? It's almost as if your house was a clown car." Ahmed took full advantage of this tragedy against his family, publishing a flurry of op-eds in the weeks that followed. There's no real denouncement of Israel on any sort of systemic level included in any of them. Yet he did nonetheless find the time to write an article which was subtitled, "Everyone Must Denounce Hamas." Interesting priorities to have in the wake of Israel literally massacring 31 members of your family, right? In one of these articles, he even acknowledged the flurry of hatred that he received from the very Zionists who he works for, who, according to him, were accusing his family members of being Hamas and mocking his sadness. However, he only even mentions that in order to compare those people to the pro-Palestine people who were pointing out the fact to him that he's a shameless collaborator and yet Israel is still killing his family. As is common with these as a Palestinian propagandists, they only say negative things about Israel or its supporters in order to draw a false, both sides are bad sort of equivalence to denounce pro-Palestinian people or Palestinians. Now, you might think that it's difficult to top all of that. After all, Alkhatib has remained a staunch both sides propagandist, while Gaza has been leveled to the ground and its people, including his family, exterminated. But nothing could prepare you for this post of his. Al-Khatib attended an illustrious pro-Israel social event in the US, another one of the great opportunities offered to him as a result of him selling out his people. There, he had a conversation with Ayelet Shaked, an openly genocidal Israeli politician and former government minister who most recently made headlines for calling for the killing and forced deportations of all Palestinians from Gaza. Her lust for genocide is so extreme that she was recently denied entry into Australia for her views, which is quite significant given that the Australian government is very pro-Israel. So that she was even at this event, which also included the presence of a former Israeli Prime Minister, should give you a fair indication of the kind of gathering that it was and the kind of company that Al-Khatib keeps. According to Al-Khatib, his goal was to talk to her and convince her that Palestinians like him are indeed human beings, presumably by showing her that pro-Israel Palestinians like himself exist. Yet Shaked greeted him not with a hello or anything normal, but rather a statement. All of Gaza is Hamas. Literally, that is not an exaggeration. He says that was the first thing that she said to him. She then asked him delightful questions like, "How are you sure that your doctor father was not Hamas?" Yet pathetic as he is, Ahmed continued to talk to her for 2 hours, desperately trying to convince her that he and other Palestinians are indeed human, though not on the basis that they deserve basic rights like self-determination and dignity or anything like that, but rather by attempting to frame some Palestinians as being like him, as capable and potentially useful to Israeli interests. Now, that's someone who has been openly genocidal for decades, and who's actually been a member of the Israeli government attempting to implement genocidal policy on Palestinians. She very obviously wants Palestinians gone because they are an impediment to her goal of total Jewish supremacy over all of the land. Yet Al-Khatib was happy to pretend that a former Netanyahu government minister had merely been misled and had some unfortunate misconceptions that he could change by showing her that there are good ones among the Palestinians like him, among the people who she wants exterminated so that Israel can take their land. It's like a Jew sitting down with Adolf Hitler and trying to convince him that he's actually a person. It's not going to happen, and you know that. Al-Khatib is living proof that regardless of how much you try to paint yourself as respectable to your oppressor, you will still never be fully human for them. And knowing that fully well, as he surely does at this point, yet continuing to do so, is the most pathetic thing I have ever seen in my life. It is pure, unadulterated, self-inflicted humiliation of the highest order. A rational reaction to that sort of conversation would be to realize that debating your own humanity with people who consider you akin to an animal is a ridiculous thing to do, and that such people simply need to be fought against. But Al-Khatib derives way too much personal benefit from degrading himself like that. That sort of thing gets him think tank fellowships. It gets him degrees from US military universities. It gets him media exposure. It gets him invitations to high-profile Zionist events. It gets him a sizable social media following that he can monetize. So he's happy to just keep doing precisely what he has been doing still. His service to Israel and to American foreign policy goals has gained him a sort of begrudging acceptance in the upper echelons of a country whose government hates him and his people, and he seems to be okay with that arrangement. Nonetheless, despite all of this, I want to say that at least I could potentially see Al-Khatib redeeming himself in the future. He comes off as a lot more sincere than the other two, and he has gone through unimaginable trauma at the hands of Israel, and it just makes me wonder when he's going to realize that many other Palestinians have been through the same thing that he does, and that is where their hatred for Israel rightfully comes from. We've covered here just 3 of some of the most prominent Palestinian traitors, each of whom is profiting quite handsomely from the harm that Israel does to Palestinians, which each of them does their own small part in enabling. The Palestinian traitor industry has been booming ever since the beginning of the Gaza genocide, as Israel and its allies are desperate to justify it, and having a Palestinian do so has obvious utility for them. And for the ones who've taken them up on this bargain, the slaughter of their people has, for them, resulted in unprecedented profit. There is far more incentive now than ever before to be a Palestinian face, spouting pro-Israel and both sides of the same propaganda. Yet despite that, still relatively few Palestinians have actually been enticed into doing this. Hell, one of the examples that I went over here can scarcely even be considered a Palestinian. When massive monetary and social incentives are on offer to those who betray their people in this way, yet Israel and its allies still struggle to recruit more than perhaps a few dozen people into this, that is a clear indicator of just how morally clear this issue really is. I hope this video has helped you to see through some of the strategies that are used by pro-Israel propagandists, and has made you more inclined to critically analyze some of these supposedly representative Palestinian voices who you might see trotted out in the Western media and online. Because remember, even if, as a Palestinian is tacked on to some Israeli propaganda phrase, it's still Israeli propaganda. The identity of the person saying it does not make it any less bunk. Anyway, if you like this video, subscribe to my channel for more, and if you want to support my channel monetarily, you can do so by heading on over to Patreon or Ko-fi and becoming a monthly supporter, or on Ko-fi you can also make a one-time donation. Thanks for watching, see you next time. Thanks to all of my patrons, and especially my $25 plus patrons: Jel Cribson, Brosnan, Aizmalad, Robocomi, Qualia, Osman Malik, Lucian, Jackagora, Yamakawat Yahabib, CW, Michelle Bagnall, the Son of Sandy, S, Geordie, and my $10 plus patrons: Christian Corniels, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Eric Macdans, Ugopnik, Nabiru, B, Johnny Rocket, Firefox42, Happy Nephron, Minijan, Eric Perkins, Ant, Max Halland, Jack Paul, Louis Bravo, Kieran Goodwin, Megan Lowndes, Soyborn, Comrade Nabule, Clement Fudge, Hector Obregon, Asma B, Support Libraries, Jizdog, Cockled Badger, T Street, Aramis Goodspiel, Liam Rowe, Abzarosi, Gabba Gundam 4444, Bubbly T, Adrian Naku, The Big L, Ibrahim Al-Shakawi, Goio, Lorenzino, Lee Breeze, Mira, Atawin, Okolano, and the Empanada Brigades. See you guys next time.